Will wasn't underrepresenting what happened. He talks about my having some kind of influence and giving him permission to have me come here. Will literally changed the trajectory of my life. And I'm going to explain that in some general ways, but I'll be happy to share the details for private conversations. And when he asks me, well, if you will come, who would you recommend? The first two people that I spoke about were Rick Moody, Dr. Carol Orsborn, Dr. Rick Moody, the best in the country. And so I'm really thrilled to be here to share time with them today as well as the experience. A friend of 35 years said that, oh, you're speaking? I'm in Asheville. I can be there in 6 hours. I would like to come. And I said, I would be delighted. This is one of Max Paul Franklin, and he's one of the best storytellers and creators of films about Christian, spiritual, and religious products, I guess you could say, speaking as a marketer. And I want to be the first to acknowledge that today is Max Paul's birthday. Yay. All right, so we've got a lot of material. If you can move any closer, I would advise it because I try to keep the slides easy to read, but we're a bit small for the size of the room. And there's some seats up here in the front. So let me introduce you to somebody. And this person knew me longer than anybody on this planet, as is the case for most of us. This is my sister Julie. And Julie had an amazing life. First of all, in her high school of 800, she was selected as the head cheerleader. And think back to the early 60s, how big a deal that was. Then she was selected for the dramatic lead in several Broadway plays at a critically acclaimed high school, not unlike Hollywood High School, playing in plays like Oklahoma, Charlie's Aunt. Some of you will remember those because they were popular in the 60s. She then had 3 beautiful children. Being somewhat of an entrepreneur, she didn't want to work for a corporation. She tried on a couple things, but she needed to work for herself, so she got licensed as an esthetician and hooked her practice up with some of the top plastic surgery organizations in San Francisco and served some of the elite women and men of the San Francisco area. She did that for about 20 years, and then it was starting to look like time to retire. However, because of her enormous creative skills and her sense of design, she was pigeonholed to do meeting planning and do very high-end conferences featuring famous people and celebrities, and to the max. So that took her a little while, but her daughter, her oldest daughter, was struggling to move beyond, muck jobs to a career, and the pathway was emergency medical technician. So Julie studied to become an emergency medical technician and get licensed in her 60s. She never actually practiced, but her car never passed an automobile accident after that. This has been somebody that obviously, as my only sibling, had a lot of influence on my life. She was very quick to tell me exactly how I should feel and what I should do. And she would advise all of you of the same thing. In other words, you ought to color that hair. You're looking rather dull. Or that lipstick's all wrong. Or she came and visited one time and completely rearranged my living room while I was away from the house. That was my sister. But like all of us, Julie had tragedies in her life, and I'm going to tell you about 2 of them. One, her youngest daughter, Heather, at age 28, was in a fatal car accident. She was the passenger in the car, hit broadside at highway speeds, and unfortunately, that was the end of Heather's life. That was in 1997, and that put my sister into a sense of grief that I'm sure any of you who have lost a child know or can imagine if you have a child and haven't lost that child, how deep that grief was. And that launched, even though my sister participated in the congregational church of my family and later became a member of the Episcopal Church, St. David's, she pretty much let religion fall to the wayside. But when she lost Heather, she began a spiritual and religious and existential exploration of depth. So she, read many books, but one of the things that she found much solace in is her pets. 5 horses, 3 dogs, 2 cats. I could never kiss a horse like that, personally. But I get it, that was my sister. But she would send me books all the time. Conversations with God, part 1, part 2, part 3. And the best thinkers, multidisciplinary, to teach me what she was learning about the spiritual life. One of the big moments in her life, being a meeting planner for her husband's insurance company, for Joel, she had Mitch Albom come, but she also had Doris Kearns Goodwin, Frank McCourt. This was a big deal, the authors' luncheons, and she organized it magnificently. But the second thing that happened to Julie was cancer. And it was stage 4. It was the type of lung cancer that is the most common in women who have never smoked. It's what killed Dana Reeves, Superman's wife, shortly after Superman died. So she was treated in hospice during her last week of life. And you can understand the struggle. I'm sure some of you have been through it, of what it's like to be a family member and watching somebody leave. So I walked outside with my camera, and there was this bush alive with life, birds and bees and this monarch butterfly. And I didn't know that at the time, but the monarch butterfly in some spiritual traditions shows up when a soul is leaving the body. I did not know that when I took this photo. Nor did I know, frankly, that the monarch butterfly is a symbol of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that afternoon, a hospice chaplain stopped by from the hospice, Mark McCann. He was ordained in the Catholic tradition, but he showed up, and I felt immediate peace with all the turmoil, all the grief, all the sadness. It was just his aura, and I'm sure that many of you have that aura. I know Will has that aura, and it's an aura that settles you. And he sat my family down around a dining room table, and he said, I have a question for you. We've got to get ourselves back to the garden. You can understand the disconnection on that question and the way we were feeling, but it was a brilliant question because it taught us something we needed to understand. How are we going to adapt to the fact of our life that Julie was leaving? I was able to understand through Mark a lot of the process, and his approach was always to ask profound questions every time we met with him for grief counseling. This is the status of an entire generation of people who have questions, who need comfort, who want to reconnect with their spiritual core. So, I have a question for you. Given all of Julie's intense spiritual interest, she did go to church, watching Joel Osteen on television, but why didn't she return to a brick-and-mortar church in her hometown, Episcopal or any church? Well, you could say it's because she didn't. That'd be a good answer. Let me give you a different answer to provoke your thinking. I would like to say it was because she wasn't invited. So we have millions of baby boomers out there who understand marketing because they've been marketed to since they were little children, babies. And I suggest to you that the question I would like to answer for the rest of my presentation is this: how do we revive the spirit of the boomer? How do we revive the spiritual nature of the baby boomer? Because if this church is going to grow, I suggest that that's exactly what we have to do. So let's examine it.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear.
All right, I'm going to take you through a lot of information, both didactic and experiential. I'm going to go fairly fast because of the time available. Just strap on your seatbelts and let's go. First of all, let's talk about the generations, because generations interact with each other. This is the generations between 1928 and 2012. You in the back are going to have a hard time seeing the details on this, but basically, I have studied many sources. There's a lot of disagreement about when one generation ends and another begins. Probably the only one that there's a firm answer to is the boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, originally 76 million. The rest of the generations I'm going to break down a little bit for you in some detail. This is Boomerstock, so you will be hearing music, just in case you wanted to know. Anyway, the silent generation represents 29 million Americans, and you can think of them in terms of some of their formative experiences and icons. Do you recognize this icon? That's Neil Young, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. A lot of people think he's a boomer, but no, and many of the rock idols of the 70s and 60s were silent generation members. One of the successful companies that were started by a silent generation member, very successful, mega successful, Oracle, Larry Ellison. And probably one of the keystone part of their formative experiences, of which there are many, is what I would call the consciousness movement. You recognize this person. This is Gloria Steinem. Every generation has values. The values can get long and many, but I'm going to summarize it very simply. First of all, the silent generation is the most economically successful generation. The best year to have been born in the 20th century, if you were going to have economic success just based on your birth year, is 1938. They mentored the consciousness revolution. A lot of people think, well, it was the boomers. No, it wasn't. It was Betty Friedan. It was Gloria Steinem. It was Dennis Hayes who found the modern Earth Day. And, of course, Martin Luther King. All of those movements were members of the silent generation. If you remember Happy Days on television, Ron Howard's Happy Days, that was a bit of a stereotype, but it got to a point that this generation grew up fairly happy and gregarious. Because they follow behind the greatest generation, they are very hardworking and a very responsible generation, patriotic. They do not like to get into ideological battles if they can avoid it, unlike their younger brothers and sisters, the boomers, or their parents, the greatest generation. And the silent generation built most of the major companies and institutions, nonprofit and so forth, that populate our land today. Their contribution is enormous, particularly relative to the size of the generation. We'll get back to the boomers, in case you wondered what happened to them. Generation X followed the baby boomers. They were often the children of the silent generation. Their formative experiences were a lot different. Their icons include, you recognize this guy, Matt Damon, who's got a tremendous nonprofit called water.org, a company developed by Generation X that has been mega successful, Google. And then one of the key formative experiences that influenced their outlook, generationally speaking, is the crash not of 2008, but of actually 1987. Came right at that time when they were just beginning to get into later in school and moving into college and their careers. Because of the nature of our culture back in the 80s, they kind of grew up in a time of cultural hostility. That's when we had all the movies that featured bad children like Chucky and The Exorcist. 1973 was the lowest birth year in the 20th century, right in the middle of X. As a result, they are often sometimes called, at least part of them, the latchkey kids, because their moms were the first set of women going into the workforce quite aggressively. But they're free agents, self-reliant, entrepreneurial. You see that even in those that work in corporations or nonprofits. Like the boomers, they have a disaffection with governance, even though they're becoming the governance. They took gender equality, which was inspired by the silent generation and taken forward by the boomers, they took it mainstream. They're technologically wired and savvy. They grew up with digital technology. And as a consequence, you can say that Generation X reinvented global business, particularly the digital and the internet platforms.
Every time they turn the lights down, just wanna go that extra mile for you.
So the children of the baby boomers, the millennials, we know a lot about them. They're very popular in media today. This is Ellen Page, probably representative of one of their icons. Starred in Juno, won an Academy Award, and in Inception with DiCaprio. Facebook is a company that clearly is identified with the millennial generation. And the significant formative event is 9/11. Its impact on that generation is huge. Their values include, they grew up during the 90s, they were the babies on board, very optimistic, inclusive. They consequently are very effective team players, as you probably know. They like to work in teams where the boomers were not quite so attracted to that. They're very idealistic like their parents, and their idealism is coming to the forefront today with things like the sustainability movement. They tend to be liberal on social and political issues. They measure that way on everything from marijuana usage to GLBT relations. They are a generation that seeks peer communities. They've created a lot of these social networks that we boomers have come in and populated, like Facebook. And they want to help you create your product. They will not be marginalized. You have to appreciate their input and get it.
That's what makes you beautiful.
So Generation Z are the children of the millennials, often. And so therefore the boomers' grandchildren. They have been heavily impacted by the post-9/11 recession. That's some of their earliest formative memories. In high school, 72% are claiming they want to start a business. When I was in high school, I doubt if it was 5% of my classmates said, "Oh, yeah, I'm going to start a business." Very entrepreneurial. Because they've had the world of knowledge available to them through the internet and so forth, they are very oriented toward learning. And they are becoming more symbolic. So if you don't, if your phones are not using emojis, you're out of it. You're no longer cool. So just know that. They come from multi-generational households. A lot of them are being raised by grandparents. And it's interesting that they actually have a very strong affinity to the elderly. That's a characteristic.
Doctor, my eyes have seen the years and the slow parade of fears without crying. Now I want to understand.
So this would be our governor of Colorado, the first boomer. And so the boomers, Tom Hanks, he's actually had a TV series on PBS. Some of you may have seen that. He is very focused on being boomer, so he's a good icon. A company created by the boomers that is a mega company. Can you guess? Microsoft. The formative experience that we could probably say had the most impact upon the baby boomers, Vietnam. The values of the baby boom generation include individuality and self-expression. We were raised to start honoring our own worth. That came through a lot of different sources, but Dr. Benjamin Spock wrote a book that 9 out of 10 greatest generation women read and paid attention to, and that involved nurturing the self-confidence of the young child. As a consequence, we're a generation that looks at personal growth and development as critical. Over a third of us have college degrees. We're interested in education. We believe in inclusiveness and equality. As I said, Generation X took it mainstream, but I have yet to meet a leading edge boomer woman who went into the workforce back into the 70s who did not feel some sense of sexism in some way, whether it was Sally, get the coffee, or we don't need you in this meeting, just the guys. Adventure and enrichment are a signature for this generation. They are world traveled. They are going to get more so. But they have a bit of an anti-authoritarian streak, and if you are going, what, really? Just pay attention to the presidential election going on between Trump and Hillary. I mean, that's anti-authoritarian to the max. Boomers like to stay in control. They've been offered options their entire life in every product category. So, naturally, we as a generation have huge expectations, even now. So, just a quick review of the demographic impact. In 2007, 65 plus in America had 40 million members. 65 plus in 2040 is going to be 80 million, doubling. That's going to change your dynamics. 14% of boomers never married. But more interesting, or as interesting, is that 19% of boomers have no children. That's double the greatest generation. And 17% only have one. So 36% of the boomer generation has 0 or 1 child. That's an opportunity for the church. Right now, almost half of them are serving as unpaid caregivers. And that is a huge burden, as you know, done with love, but it changes a life. So the economic impact cannot be overemphasized because that is where the money in this country is concentrated. 77% of all private wealth, half of all consumer spending in the United States, but yet representing only 26% of the U.S. population. Spending $3 trillion a year on goods and services, and I've seen numbers larger than that, and actually possessing $15 trillion in assets. It's almost the GDP of the U.S. for 1 year. The boomers have transformed every life stage that they've gone through, and this slide is going to demonstrate that, and I'll speak it out for those there in the back. So, when they were babies, there were 4 of them in the family on average. The greatest generation moms got really sick of baby food, preparing it from scratch. So Gerber's became a significant brand from nowhere. So did Johnson & Johnson Band-Aids also. When they were teeny boppers, which is what we were called when we were teenies, we liked salt, sugar, high-fat foods. So fast food started taking off. Guess who became a big company? Same thing with student activists. There was a reaction against Detroit and the chrome-laden cars and things like that. So GM was in the tank, and the Beetle, Toyota, Datsun all came forward. Also to answer the question of sustainability and saving money. When the boomers became yuppies in the 80s, fitness became a craze. Can you think of a brand that might have become dominant? Nike? That's the one. There are others, but that's one of them. As middle-aged adults, because they traveled a lot and experienced European culture, Maxwell House and Folgers wasn't going to get it, so Howard Schultz, a baby boomer, started a little company called Starbucks. As aging adults, what is going to be the big transformation? I can't say I actually know. I wish I could, because I'd be investing stock. However, I know the theme for the boomers going forward is going to be freedom. That's the signature word, freedom. So, just to submit an idea, I see possibilities for Uber, both to provide work for boomers who are underfunded. I should have mentioned that the wealth that I talked about is concentrated in about half the generation. Or as quick transportation to take the place of assisted living transportation. So that's an example. So what's a generation? Okay, we talk about demographics. Is that a generation? No, not really. Generations are formed, and I thank Dr. Rick Moody for advising me I ought to understand this concept if I was going to stay in the field for any period of time, and that's the age period cohort model, sociological model. It's applied in other fields like chemistry and physics. So I'm going to take you through this model and in a matter of just a little bit of time explain to you what this generation really is from a generational perspective. Carl Mannheim, the founder of the field of sociology, wrote a phenomenal and seminal essay in 1922 that got republished in 52. That essay has been validated by empirical research over the last 3 or 4 decades. And Mannheim said that a generation involves a taste, outlook, and spirit characteristic of a historical period or of the generation itself. That is the cohort effect. What does that mean? Well, just in case you wanted to know what Carl Mannheim looked at, he was a ladies' man. I thought he was like Einstein or something, but no. He liked to play the field. But that's the man, the founder of the field of sociology and generational thinking, father of that too. He said a generation is a common location in the historical dimension of the social process. That takes a little moment or two to digest. It's a social location. Generations are located in history, and it's their social interactions or not that determine how bonded together the generation is. So there's a million photos like this that baby boomers all over the country will recognize. Even if this one was Topeka, Kansas, and I'm sitting right there, this side, second person in the back, right behind Tom Averill. That's where our experiential process began. But Mannheim noted that we get a lot of our values from older generations. Think of the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. Those are values. They're handed down, books, tapes, parents, teachers, and so forth. So there's intergenerational continuity. So again, the founders of our country instill us with a lot of our values that we all hold precious. But Mannheim noted something else. And it is the nature of biology meeting sociology. Between the ages of about 11 or 12 and 25, what happens in the lives of a generation determine their outlook. That's when the formative values of a generation are formed. So for the boomers, as I've already mentioned, Vietnam has to be probably at the top of the hierarchy of influences because it affected everything else, social, cultural, and so forth. So when we're little children, we appropriate memories. And all of us in this room have memories of the Civil War. George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. These are memories, not just facts. We appropriate memories, but when we reach that beginning age of maturity, we acquire memories. And those memories are mediated by our peer groups, meaning they change the content of our experience. So for me, it was Rodney Wilson. killed in 1969 in Vietnam. Max Paul Franklin was a helicopter pilot in 1960, at least during the Vietnam War. That changes. That makes it personal. That's different. So Mannheim noted that a generation starts developing a consciousness of its own. And in my case, this is October the 15th, 1969. That was my girlfriend. She's got a black armband on. That was the largest peaceful protest of any war in history, October the 15th, 1969. But he allowed for the fact that there's not just a homogeneous view of the world. So there's the Vietnam War soldier story also, not just the protests, but there are generational units within a generation, but the big ideas they share are shared alike. So if a generation has a lot of turmoil during these critical years, then something else happens.
People try to put us to down. Talking about my generation.
We begin identifying ourselves as a generation, and we start mediating our experiences, and those experiences get turned into values, and those values go forward in life. Let me repeat, those values get carried throughout life, continuing practice as Mannheim described it. So you absolutely, to understand a generation, you have to look into the past. So wander down memory lane with me for a moment with Buffy. She was the Methodist when she grew up. She's now 67 years old. And Buffy not only had the Methodist Church to influence her spiritual and religious outlook, she had a few other things that influence it, such as Captain Kangaroo. The TV programs of the 50s were very, very focused on moral teaching, if you think about it. Even The Lone Ranger was all about moral teaching. The Flying Nun, Sally Field, had a big impact on some boomer women. You all know the story of Duck and Cover. Those of us who were boomers had to go through that and live in fear of thermonuclear holocaust. It was not something we did not worry about. But with that came postmodern feminism. Betty Friedan, the feminine mystique. Gloria Steinem. But of course the big deal in terms of influence was the Vietnam War. And that inspired the counterculture and the sexual revolution. And just about the time that all came focused, came something called cosmic rock.
Just what is happening to me? I lie awake with the sound of the sea.
The Moody Blues, In Search of the Lost Chord, was one of the top albums. And if you can, in the back you may not see this, but it's a enlightened spirit lifting up between the facts of birth and death. So in that album, a lot of people who even are familiar with don't know that there is In Search of the Lost Chord. There is a lost chord. Anybody know what the lost chord is? I didn't think so. Well, here it is. Naturally, Will's already spoken eloquently to the idea of Woodstock.
We are stardust, we are golden.
And it's not a misstatement that actually Woodstock was a spiritual event as well as a music event in many different ways. The high-tech industry really took off with the boomers and the space program, so we started becoming very tech-focused, which has taken us through our entire lives. And of course, we can't underestimate the Beatles. And the Beatles did have many spiritual, moral values embedded in their songs, beyond I Want to Hold Your Hand. And they took a spiritual turn with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. and the founder of Transcendental Meditation. But when they split up, certainly John Lennon and George Harrison took very spiritual paths with their subsequent music.
My sweet Lord, my Lord.
Then the boomers started experimenting with every kind of religion ever thought of, including the earth and the phenomenon of Mother Earth, Buddhism, astrology, even angels. I remember my sister had angels all over her house in addition. But then came the big one. So that is a quick digest of the spiritual journey. Does this make any difference? Well, I didn't know for sure when I wrote my first book, Marking Leading Edge Baby Boomers. I just believed it. But since that time, hard research has come out by Columbia University as an example to demonstrate that the most formative years of our lives in value formation roughly occurs between 11 or 12 and roughly 14 to 24 is what the actual copy says there. But there's more, as the advertiser guy says. The largest majority of the boomers feel that their generational label is a good fit. Now think about it. It's not just the word boomer, which was not assigned to them until 1980. By the editor of People magazine, Landon Jones, who wrote the first time that the boomer word became part of popular culture. It's the values, it's the sense of identity. And that is further, so you can see that, just for a second, millennials, for example, feel that the millennial, only 30% believe that the millennial label is either a very good fit or a fairly good fit for their generation. The silent generation, only a total of 14%. And there's a reason for that. Maybe Rick will discuss that a little bit. But well, you're very on the cusp, though, Rick. Anyway, the power of boomer cannot be underestimated here. 80% of boomers feel that they identify with their generation. And that's huge. Look at, well, again, the silent generation. Only 18% identify as silent generation, and 34% tend to see themselves more like the greatest generation, and 34% see themselves more like boomers, which would be the case for my sister. She was a silent generation member, but she saw herself value-wise as a boomer. So I want you to take a look at a commercial which uses the cohort effect really well, in my judgment. Pay special attention to the boomer grandmother and her Generation Z granddaughter. Also pay attention to the very slightly perturbed Generation X mother. And be sure to look at the sign as they are exiting the commercial.
This one I got in Belize. I was naked ziplining with a man. No, we're fine, honey. This is good. This is great. I'm teaching her.
Does this look familiar, Mom?
Yes, I think this is it.
Can you really talk to cats?
Of course. Ah, the air. There it is. This is where I met your grandpa. Right under this tree.
Some things are worth holding on to.
They're hugging the tree.
That's why we got a Subaru.
Was it that tree?
The 2015 Subaru Outback. Love, it's what makes a Subaru a Subaru.
Interesting that boomers pretty much can be responsible for building the brand Subaru. It's got a long and huge legacy with the generation. So They're selling to everybody, but certainly the boomers and the Xers in this commercial. So now I come to this one fundamental issue, another opportunity, which is a problem, and that is loneliness. It's getting a lot of conversation among think groups like one that Rick and I belong to. Loneliness is clearly seen as a building problem. What is it? It's unhappiness, pessimism, self-blame, depression, and it's alleviated by social networks. Do churches provide social networks? Yes, of course they do. Nostalgia is when we think of momentous events and settings, and some people think that's idle thinking or silly. But the truth of the matter is, when you are nostalgic, stop for a second and ask yourself, is my nostalgic reflection redemptive? In other words, I'm going from a dismal situation to a triumphant situation. The content of a lot of nostalgia is, here's the fact: loneliness trumps obesity as an early predictor of death. Loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, because loneliness increases cortisol, the stress hormone. So, the research has been shown, both done in Asia, Europe, and the US, that nostalgia can add and supplement to social support. In fact, the authors of the study, the past, when appropriately harnessed, can strengthen psychological resistance to the vicissitudes of life. Nostalgia can reduce death thought anxiety. So does nostalgia have a place with boomers? I think that's worth thinking about. So we're going to go to the second leg of the stool, the age period cohort model, and that'll be life stage. I know Dr. Osborne will be talking about that in some depth. It's the universal seasons of life influence how you perceive and react to the world. Devotees to this point of view believe that we're all alike. When we reach a certain life stage, typical things happen. Like when we're in our 20s and early 30s, we have children. When we become in our 50s, we start planning for and anticipating retirement, and so forth. And so that is the age effect, but there's more to it than that. So let's take a look at the boomer present real quickly.
Oh man, take a look at my life. I'm a lot like you.
A mature mind has other priorities than a young mind, one of which is emotional relevance. Dr. Moody and I know personally Laura Carstensen, Dr. Laura Carstensen at Stanford, who's done a tremendous amount of research and developed something called the socio-emotional selectivity theory, or in shorthand, the positivity effect. And that has been validated with significant research that the aging brain filters out negative emotions. So fire and brimstone are not the best path to the aging brain, even though we know that time is short and the big leap is coming. That's not the best way to involve us. We will actually filter out negative information, and we will look at, attend to, hold in memory, and store in memory positive emotions. And that's why my friend Max Paul Franklin is so good at telling stories, because they're positive stories about redemption and triumph, as well as the positive side of life. So emotional relevance is critical. So, too, is the demand for facts. We boomers have had access our whole lives. The number one users of WebMD are not coincidentally the boomers. So we can go diagnose all of our various aging-related elements. So once you've reached somebody emotionally through advertising and branding and marketing, you need to be prepared to give them facts. And that can be done very conveniently on websites. You can provide layers of facts if you need to, for people that want to dig and learn. We've talked about the individualistic nature and of the boomers, and that can be handled in marketing with direct marketing, whether that be direct e-marketing, direct mail marketing. You've seen the direct mail that's come to you that's been highly personalized. Everything, copy, photos, name, everything can be personalized. And there's data out there where we can literally know 100 data points about most of you in this room. So we can really know who we're targeting on an individual basis. As we grow older, naturally, our altruistic values, our desire to leave a legacy, our desire to give back increases. Rick and I had a very dear colleague by the name of David Wolf, who was a very profound and prolific writer in the field of aging, and he said something that always stuck with me as poignant, and that is that as we grow older, we become more individuated, autonomous, and introspective. The autonomous is a problem for the church, but the introspective is an opportunity. And for those of you who are quantitatively oriented, and I try to be, here's some research done by Yankelovich. I'm sure you're going to be able to read that last line at the back of the room, but let me go over it with you anyway. The elements covered are marriage, fitness, travel, auto, large home, jewelry, and clothes in that order. The last four were what we think of the material markers of success. The first three, marriage, fitness, travel, can be thought of as the experiential markers of success. The question the boomers are asked is, how do you define success now? And it's the experiential side of life that is clearly more important than another Rolex watch or the third speedboat.
Take a chance when you refuse to grow up, baby.
So in a nutshell, and I have to take a 50,000-foot look at marketing with the time I have, as well as just we'd have to do a day workshop. But in experience marketing here, there are 4 ingredients, and you market experiences. So what are those 4 elements? Number 1, to boomers, an experience, or any generation, but boomers in particular, whatever you do better be entertaining. You're not going to hold their attention, and you're not going to keep them engaged. Max Paul has taught me over the many years his profound respect and love of the Disney organization. The aesthetic, the second E, is multi-sensory experiences. You create a story, and the boomers walk into your story, okay? And the aesthetic means that you think multi-sensory. Obviously, when we have a profound experience, we like to have a sense of escape. That can be transcendental escape. That can be the moment of discovery that occurs when somebody realizes something they didn't have before. And then, again, back to education. Instead of taking a tour of Italy, this woman decided to paint a church. Well, she was actually with a class, so she was learning how to paint. When you do those 4 elements well, and you combine them well, then you can create a transformative experience. The most powerful experience is the experience that transforms your audience. They change, like they did at Woodstock. And sometimes those changes go through generations. Now, I'm going to show you a combination. I haven't talked much about the period effect that's coming, but this particular ad by GE has the cohort effect. Look for it. It has the age effect, look for it, and the period effect are things that are going on in people's lives now, big stories in our lives today. In 1 minute, this is a boomer story.
I've seen beautiful things. I've seen the sunrise paint the desert. Witness snowfall on the first day of spring. Watched fireflies dance about the evening sky. But the most beautiful thing I've ever seen was the image on a screen that helped our doctor see my wife's cancer was treatable.
GE Technologies help doctors detect cancer early so they can save more lives, bringing better health to more people.
Now, the interesting thing about this is that they don't sell this technology to consumers. And this ad ran on the Super Bowl. Why would they do it? Well, it's called branding. Both GE as well as making us aware, because we are the kind of people say, well, doctor, I heard about, making us aware that they had this technology and this is a company for our future health. So that was the whole purpose of it, not to sell the technology. That's sold to hospitals. So we're at the third leg of the stool, and I'll move along quickly now so I can wrap up. And that's the changing and evolving environmental events around a generation through life, because we are changed by experiences. Even those durable values tend to hold true, we nevertheless are changed. Whether that be terrorism or look at how quickly GBLT rights have emerged into mainstream culture after decades of struggle.
There are people who are wondering, these are the days of farewell.
Well, not entirely yet, but so let me look at some of the priorities for boomers today. I have a lot on that, but I'm going to reduce it to just about 4 areas. Number one, this is a generation that took the doctor out of, stopped the autocratic doctor, basically, and said, no, we're going to be partners, and I'm going to tell you a few things, doc. So, self-directed care became a signature of the boomer generation. That is the same going forward. The number one thing, if you want to know in 3 words what is going to create billions of dollars of economic value, maybe trillions, it's compression of morbidity. What is that? Live a long life, vital and active, and die fast. And there's going to be billions of dollars spent on making that dream come true. A lot of it's going to help. A lot more people are not going to be doing this long, slow decline. They're going to stay fairly active. There's going to be a huge debate in society and in individual lives about slow versus heroic medicine. Well, if you just took this one $12,000 a week pill, we might give you another couple of months. But you're going to be really sick. Or stop the treatment. I know I'll live longer. Odds are if I go into hospice. So again, a lot of work on preventative and diagnostic medicine to enrich. The boomers are going to be the test market for digital health. Bottom line, the digital health industry is exploding. And I think the challenge that we all face can be summarized, all of us in this room can be summarized in this one commercial, which was created in Canada.
What will your last 10 years look like? Will you be quick enough for a game of tag with your grandchild? Strong enough to embrace every moment? Will you grow old with vitality? Or get old with disease? It's time to decide. The average Canadian will spend their last 10 years in sickness. Change your future at makehealthlast.ca.
Now, don't you think there is a case to be made for making your spiritual health last? So travel, here my wife and I are in the fantastic place of Iceland. Travel is going to be a huge agenda item. I talked to the travel industry. That's part of my background. I'm the former head of a Convention Visitors Bureau, former head of advertising for the Broadmoor Hotel, a 5-star resort. And what we're going to be seeking is creative experiences and authenticity. I remember my sister telling me that the insurance company my brother-in-law owned took all their top salespeople to tour the Sistine Chapel. How many of you have laid on the floor of the Sistine Chapel and looked up at it for a half an hour? Because, you know, going like this doesn't work really well for very long. Well, that's because it was an authentic and creative experience that was uncommon. So that can be also manifested within a church environment too. Health and wellness continues to be a primary deal. I've always said I like to come back from a vacation in better shape than when I left rather than packing 10 more pounds and feeling guilty. Community and family are important. This is your opportunity because the boomers want to be with their children and grandchildren. And so we're going to see a lot of celebration vacations going forward. Retirement, 80th birthday, 70th birthday, all of those things are going to create a big market for travel. Grandparenting is huge. Remember the boomers put the placard in their cars that said baby on board? Sorry, millennials, but that was you. Well, hold on to your seat. Watch what they're going to be like as grandparents. There's 75 million people and about 75% of people over 50 that are grandparents. 78%, according to new research, want to discuss moral values with their children or grandchildren. 72% actually teach religion and spirituality. 89% feel that they play a pivotal role in their Generation Z grandchild. And I told you this earlier, 6 million are being raised, 6 million Generation Z members are being raised by their grandparents. Philanthropy is obviously a huge issue as we're trying to go forward in life and make a difference, leave a legacy. So I just thought you ought to know these numbers in case you're concerned about the financial future of the Methodist Church. The boomers are going to donate $6.6 trillion to charities and provide $1.4 trillion in volunteer services. Last year, 53% donated to religious or spiritual nonprofits, but 28% are affiliated with any church. So that means you have a growth opportunity from my point of view as a marketer. 40% of boomers are not with their first spouse or any spouse at all, whether they were married or not. So dating becomes a huge issue for about 40% of the generation. Obviously, this is fueling the online affinity groups, the mature dating websites. But when a person says, okay, I need to find somebody else, I'm going to jump on Match.com and it's going to be the new me, they're going to be looking at lifestyle rehabilitation. Can you help them with that? Obviously, spirituality becomes a major part of our life journey over 60. So that, of course, is creating all the various new age and atypical and religious retreats and training. Spiritual tours are becoming a huge business within the travel industry, like visiting Lourdes, France, or, various, Ephesus, for example, in Turkey. Those kind of tours are becoming more and more popular. I believe there's a role for churches in those tours. Ultimately, in this life, we're searching for tribes, and those tribes can become renewed through a church experience. The question that is often asked, will we be thinking about death more? Or will we be thinking about it less? Well, let me give you a demonstration.
Now that we love, now that the lonely nights are over, how do we make love stay?
The youth icons, the successes of our generation are dying. And every time it happens, and I don't want to be necessarily around when Paul McCartney dies or Mick Jagger dies, I'm not looking forward to that. That increases the narrative around a youth generation thinking about this.
Good night, and joy be with you all.
So here are your opportunities in summary. These are the big trends that I've touched on. Healthy aging. So I think we can also say healthy spiritual and religious aging too, can't we? Career and life reinvention. I haven't dwelled on that much. I have other parts of my presentations that really look at this idea. That's why my second book is called Generation Reinvention. But I think life reinvention, you're in that business. Multi-generational bonding. The boomers want to be connected to their millennial children and especially their Generation Z grandchildren. 83% of boomers want to benefit others. That's a deep-seated need that you can tap into. They're in the business right now of redefining aging. That's all the conversation. 67%, almost two-thirds, believe the best years are ahead. Not behind them, but ahead. And of course, they're going to be looking at ways to renew their spousal relationships as well as discover new spouses. These are the big stories going forward. I looked and did some research, and I came across this, and you may agree or not agree that this is a good branding campaign for a church, but these are your friends over at the United Church of Christ, the congregational church that I grew up in. And this is their focus on branding their church. I want you to pay attention to the key words that pop on the screen because those are values. And then I also want you to pay attention to how did they use the cohort effect to make this more powerful? When Mark McCann showed up the second time at my sister's house, she was within an hour of death. And as I ushered him back into her bedroom, I said, Mark, could you provide some kind of service for my sister? Because she had said to the family before she became unconscious that she'd like to go to church. And I'm afraid Joel Osteen wasn't available to come and administer her in her home. And he said, sure, even though he's Catholic, he said, okay, I'll do an Episcopal type of service bedside. So he read from the Book of Common Prayer, in your hands, O merciful Savior, we commend Julie, and so on. He had us circle her body with flowers, and he led us in prayer. And then I was absolutely sure that she had completed her journey as a Christian in this life. and that she was now free to be embraced by the everlasting light.
Celebrate me home. Give me a number, please. Celebrate me home.
And thank you.